The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, the warm glow of Christmas lights flickering along the mantel. Daniel Parker adjusted the sleeves of his worn blazer as he stepped into his mother's living room, forcing a smile as he took in the familiar sight. Jonathan, his older brother, pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey. Melissa, Jonathan's perfectly composed wife, setting the table with practiced elegance, and their teenage daughter Chloe, half listening to the conversation while scrolling on her phone. Their mother, Evelyn Parker, stood by the kitchen entrance, arms crossed, her gaze landing on Daniel with that familiar look of quiet disappointment. "Ah, there he is," Jonathan said, lifting his glass as if offering a toast. "The wandering philosopher himself. I was beginning to think you weren't going to show." Daniel forced a chuckle, stepping forward to take a seat at the long oak table. "Traffic was brutal." Jonathan smirked. "Or maybe you just lost track of time again. What is it you do these days? Writing? Freelancing? Something vague and unprofitable?" Daniel clenched his jaw but kept his voice even. "I manage. I do consulting work." "Consulting?" Jonathan repeated, shaking his head. "Sounds like code for unemployed." "Jonathan," their mother chided softly, though there was no real reprimand in her tone. More like mild amusement, as if she, too, found Daniel's so-called career a perpetual source of disappointment. Daniel swallowed hard, his appetite vanishing as he glanced around the table. He had known tonight wouldn't be easy, but the weight of judgment pressing against him was suffocating. Melissa offered a polite smile, though the pity in her eyes was unmistakable. "Daniel, have you ever considered, I don't know, something more stable? Something with benefits? You're not getting any younger." Chloe snickered under her breath, not even bothering to look up from her phone. Daniel inhaled deeply, keeping his voice calm. "I like what I do." Jonathan chuckled. "Of course you do. No responsibilities, no commitments. Just floating through life like a college kid who never graduated." He leaned forward, voice lowering. "You know, Dan, at some point, people expect you to grow up." Daniel felt the heat rise in his chest, but before he could respond, Evelyn spoke up. "Jonathan, enough." But then she turned her attention to Daniel, her voice softer but no less piercing. "Your brother only wants what's best for you. Do you?" Daniel asked, finally letting the frustration seep into his voice. "Because it sounds more like you just want me to fit into your version of success." Jonathan scoffed. "Success isn't a version, Daniel. It's numbers. It's a home, a family, a legacy. Look around. Melissa and I built something. Chloe is on track for an Ivy League education. Meanwhile, you're what? Bouncing from one project to the next with nothing to show for it." Silence settled over the table like a thick fog. Daniel's hands tightened around his fork. "You think because I don't have a wife, a mortgage, and a corner office, I'm a failure?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "I think you've wasted potential. And I think deep down, you know that too." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but his mother cut in, her voice gentle yet heavy with finality. "Sweetheart, we just worry. We want you to be happy." Daniel's stomach twisted. That word, happy, as if his current life couldn't possibly include that. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. "You know what? Merry Christmas." With that, he grabbed his coat and walked out into the cold December air, leaving behind the warm lights, the smell of cinnamon, and the crushing weight of their disappointment. The night had grown colder, but Daniel hardly noticed. His mother's house, filled with the remnants of Christmas cheer, now felt like a place of shadows. As he stepped into the small study, his late father's old office, he was only looking for a moment of solitude, a break from the humiliation of dinner. Instead, he found something far more troubling. A stack of envelopes sat carelessly on the desk, partially hidden beneath an old newspaper. Daniel picked them up, flipping through bills and statements. His fingers stilled when he saw the letterhead of a bank, the bold print at the top reading, "Final notice, mortgage payment past due." His breath caught. His mother had always been cautious with money. Her house, the house she and his father built, had been fully paid off years ago. Why would she have a mortgage? Frowning, he dug deeper into the pile, pulling out a folder tucked at the back of the drawer. What he saw inside sent a chill down his spine. Contracts, loan agreements, and bank notices. The documents showed that a new mortgage had been taken out against the house, under his mother's name. And yet, The signature at the bottom of each contract didn't look quite right. It was close, almost perfect, but not hers. "Mom," he called, his voice tense. From the living room, his mother's frail voice responded, "Yes, dear? Can you come here for a second?" A moment later, she appeared in the doorway, adjusting her cardigan. "What is it, Daniel?" He hesitated, then handed her the topmost letter. "Did you know about this?" Her brow furrowed as she took the paper and read. Slowly, her fingers tightened around the edge. I don't understand. What is this?" Daniel's chest tightened. "Mom, your house has been mortgaged, and the payments are overdue." She blinked at him, her face pale. "That's impossible. I never." Her voice trailed off as she flipped through the documents Daniel handed her. Then, almost in a whisper, "I never signed this." A heavy silence settled between them. Then, suddenly, his mother let out a soft gasp and covered her mouth. "Oh God, Jonathan." Daniel's grip on the papers tightened. "What?" She shook her head, her eyes glistening. "He's been helping me with the bills ever since your father passed. I trusted him." A sick feeling curled in Daniel's stomach. He knew Jonathan was ambitious, reckless even. But this was something else entirely. Before he could respond, a voice came from the hallway. "What are you two whispering about?" "Jonathan." Daniel turned to see his older brother standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, his gaze wary. He looked confident, too confident, like a man who had long since convinced himself he would never be caught. Daniel didn't hesitate. He thrust the documents at Jonathan. "Explain this." Jonathan barely glanced at them. "It's none of your concern." "None of my concern?" Daniel's voice rose. "You forged Mom's signature and took out a mortgage on her house without telling her. And now it's on the verge of foreclosure." Their mother let out a choked sob, but Jonathan didn't flinch. He let out a slow sigh and rubbed his temple. "Calm down, Daniel. It's not what you think." "Oh, really?" Daniel snapped. "Then tell me exactly what I should think." Jonathan exhaled sharply. "It was an investment opportunity. I needed capital, and Mom wasn't using the house for anything but living in it. So, I made the money work for us." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "For us? Or for you?" Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence was answer enough. Daniel turned to his mother, his voice softer now. "Mom, we have to go to the bank. We have to report this." But Jonathan stepped forward, his expression darkening. "And then what, Daniel? Have Mom dragged into legal battles? Have her house seized immediately instead of negotiating a way out?" Daniel clenched his fists. "You stole from your own mother, Jonathan." Jonathan scoffed. "Don't be so dramatic. I had a plan. I just needed time." "Time for what?" "To let the bank take everything." Daniel's voice was shaking now, his anger barely restrained. "You lied to her. You stole her home right out from under her." Their mother let out a shaky breath. "Jonathan, how could you?" For the first time, Jonathan faltered. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Mom, I didn't mean for it to come to this." Daniel had heard enough. He turned back to his mother. "We have to act now, before it's too late." Jonathan shook his head. "You always were the self-righteous one. You think you're the hero, swooping in to fix everything. But you don't know what it's like to take real risks." Daniel stared at him, feeling a strange sense of clarity. "And you don't know what it's like to take responsibility." Jonathan smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, little brother, let's see if you can handle what comes next." The air was thick with tension as the weight of Jonathan's deception settled over them. Daniel knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. The house was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Daniel stood in the center of the living room, gripping the incriminating mortgage documents in his trembling hands. His mother, Eleanor, sat on the couch, oblivious to the storm about to break. Across from her, Jonathan swirled the last remnants of his whiskey, feigning indifference, while Melissa busied herself setting down plates as if nothing was amiss. But everything was amiss. Daniel took a deep breath and threw the stack of papers onto the coffee table. "Explain this, Jonathan. Right now." Jonathan barely glanced at the documents. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, taking another sip of his drink. "Don't play dumb with me," Daniel snapped. "I found these in the study. Mom's house is mortgaged up to its rafters, and her name is on these contracts. Only problem? That's not her signature." He turned to Eleanor, his voice softer now. "Mom, did you sign any of this? Did you even know about it?" Eleanor blinked in confusion, picking up one of the papers with shaky hands. I, I don't remember signing anything like this. Jonathan, what is this? Her voice wavered with uncertainty. Jonathan sighed and leaned back into the couch. All right, fine. Yes, I took out the mortgage. I needed the money for an investment opportunity. A real estate deal. It was supposed to be a sure thing. Daniel clenched his fists. A sure thing? You put Mom's home on the line for a gamble? Jesus, Jonathan, what the hell were you thinking? Melissa interjected, her voice laced with forced calm. Daniel, it's not as bad as you're making it out to be. We had a plan. The market was supposed to turn, and you were in on this. Daniel turned on her, his fury intensifying. You helped him do this? Melissa's face tightened. I only helped him file the paperwork. We had to move fast, and Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Fast? So fast that you had to forge Mom's signature? Do you even realize what you've done? If the bank finds out, this is fraud. It's illegal. Jonathan shot up from his seat, his patience snapping. You think I don't know that? You think I wanted this to happen? The deal went bad, Daniel. The market crashed, and now we're in a tight spot. But standing here screaming about it isn't going to fix anything. Eleanor's face drained of color as the realization dawned on her. My home. Jonathan, my home is at risk because of you. A small sound interrupted the tension. At the foot of the stairs stood Chloe, Jonathan's 14-year-old daughter. Her wide eyes shimmered with fear. Dad, is this true? You used Grandma's house for money. Jonathan paled. Chloe, sweetheart, this is. Save it, Jonathan, Daniel cut in. She deserves the truth. We all do. Chloe's gaze darted between her father and her grandmother. Grandma, are we going to lose the house? Eleanor clutched her chest. I don't know, dear. Melissa rushed to Chloe, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Sweetheart, it's complicated. Daniel exhaled sharply. No, it's not. It's simple. Jonathan stole from Mom. You helped. And now, we're all at risk of losing the one thing that keeps this family together. Jonathan's jaw clenched. I'll fix it. I just need time. Time? Daniel scoffed. We don't have time. What's your plan, huh? Another sure thing? Another risk that drags Mom even deeper into your mess. Eleanor shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. Jonathan, I raised you better than this. I trusted you. Jonathan swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. I thought I could turn things around, Mom. I really did. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Then, Eleanor straightened her spine, her voice unexpectedly firm. You are going to fix this, Jonathan. Right now? You and Melissa will go to the bank first thing tomorrow and find a way to get my name off this loan. I don't care what it takes. If you refuse, I will go to the authorities myself. Jonathan's eyes widened in shock. Mom, you wouldn't. Try me, she said, steel in her voice. I may be old, but I am not weak. You will not take my home away from me. Daniel crossed his arms. And I'll make sure she follows through. You're not getting away with this. Jonathan looked between his brother and his mother, his bravado stripped away. He nodded once, stiffly. Fine. We'll fix it. Chloe stepped closer to her grandmother, gripping her hand. I won't let them hurt you, Grandma. Eleanor smiled through her tears and squeezed Chloe's hand. Thank you, sweetheart. Daniel exhaled, tension still thrumming through his body. This was far from over, but for the first time, the balance of power had shifted. Jonathan had finally been exposed, and now there was no turning back. Daniel sat in the dimly lit office of attorney Michael Graves, his fingers tightly clasped together as he struggled to contain his emotions. Across the desk, Graves flipped through the forged mortgage contracts, his face unreadable. Finally, the lawyer exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. This is fraud, plain and simple. Your brother used your mother's name to secure a mortgage she never agreed to. We can fight this, Daniel. But it won't be easy. Daniel nodded, determination hardening his expression. I don't care how hard it is. My mother is not going to lose her home because of Jonathan's greed. Graves gave a reassuring nod. Then we'll start with an injunction to freeze any further financial activity tied to the house. But we'll need your mother's statement to support the claim. Is she willing to testify against her own son? Daniel hesitated. His mother, despite everything, still held on to the hope that Jonathan could redeem himself. But after the truth had unraveled in that living room, after her hands had trembled as she clutched the forged papers, something in her had changed. She was heartbroken, but she was no longer blind. She'll do it, Daniel said firmly. She has to. The following days were a whirlwind of legal procedures and tense conversations. Jonathan had tried to downplay the situation at first, attempting to frame himself as the victim of unfortunate circumstances. But the law was not as forgiving as their mother had been. The court ordered Jonathan to liquidate his personal assets to cover the mortgage debt. His expensive car, his vacation home, even the stock investments he had clung to as his last lifeline. All were sold off to prevent foreclosure. And still, it was barely enough. Melissa, who had stood by Jonathan through all his deceit, suddenly found her loyalty wavering when faced with the bleak reality of financial ruin. She packed her bags one evening, her voice cold as she told him, "I won't go down with you, Jonathan. You lied to me too. You told me it was under control. And now we have nothing. I refuse to live like this." Jonathan didn't beg her to stay. He knew better than anyone that Melissa's love had always been conditional. Chloe watched from the doorway as her mother walked out of the house, a single suitcase in hand. She had heard everything, every desperate argument, every frantic phone call, every weak justification her father had tried to give, and she had made her decision. Later that night, she stood in the kitchen with her grandmother, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, until finally, Chloe broke the silence. "I can't stay here anymore, Grandma. Not with him. Not after everything he's done." Her grandmother looked up, her eyes filled with both sorrow and understanding. "Where will you go, sweetheart?" Chloe took a deep breath. "A friend's place for now, then college. I'll get a job, figure things out. But I can't be part of this family anymore, not the way it is. I love you, but I need to step away." Tears welled in her grandmother's eyes, but she didn't argue. She simply reached for Chloe's hand and squeezed it. "I just want you to be happy, my dear. Whatever that takes." Daniel stood outside the courthouse a week later, watching as Jonathan exited the building, his once confident stride now replaced by a defeated shuffle. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Daniel almost felt pity. Almost. "I hope it was worth it," Daniel said quietly. "Everything you did, everything you lost." Jonathan scoffed, shaking his head. "You think you won? You think Mom forgives you just because you played the hero?" Daniel took a step closer, his voice steady. "This was never about winning, Jonathan. It was about doing the right thing. Something you should have tried for once in your life." Jonathan gave a bitter laugh. "You always were so righteous. So desperate to be seen as better than me." "No," Daniel said. "I just wanted to protect our mother. And now I have." With that, Daniel turned and walked away, leaving Jonathan standing alone in the cold. Back at his mother's house, Daniel sat across from her at the kitchen table. The home was safe now, the mortgage crisis averted, but the scars left behind would take time to heal. His mother reached out, placing a gentle hand over his. "I'm proud of you, Daniel," she whispered. "I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner." Daniel felt the tightness in his chest eased just a little. "I just did what needed to be done, Mom." She nodded. "And that's what family should do." For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he truly belonged. The morning light streamed through the window as Daniel sat across from his mother at the kitchen table. The house felt different now, quieter, almost peaceful. The storm of betrayal and anger had passed, leaving only the remnants of broken trust and lingering regret. "I still can't believe Jonathan did this," his mother murmured, staring into her cup of tea. "And Melissa? I thought she cared about this family." Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. "They cared, Mom, just not in the way we hoped. For them, family was something to use, not something to protect." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "And I was blind to it. I thought Jonathan had everything figured out, that he was the strong one, the successful one. And I treated you like you were less." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. He had spent his entire life feeling like the outsider in his own family. No matter what he did, he had always been the afterthought, the dreamer, the one who never quite fit the mold his mother had set for him. But now, as she looked at him with genuine remorse, he realized something had shifted. "I should have seen you for who you are," she continued. "The one who truly cares. The one who stood up when no one else did." He reached across the table and took her hand. "It's not too late, Mom. What matters is what we do now." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "And what are you going to do? You've spent so much time fixing everyone else's mess. What do you want for yourself?" Daniel leaned back, considering her question. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal battles and financial nightmares, but somewhere in the chaos, he had found clarity. I want to help people like you. People who don't realize they're being taken advantage of until it's too late. There are so many elderly people out there who trust their families or financial advisors blindly, and it ruins them. I want to make sure that doesn't happen to anyone else. His mother's eyes softened. That's a noble thing, Daniel. But how would you even start? With the money we saved from the settlement, he said. I want to open a financial guidance center for seniors. Teach them how to recognize fraud, help them manage their assets safely, and give them legal resources so they don't end up in the same position you were in. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they weren't from grief. That's beautiful, and you're the perfect person to do it. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Daniel stood and opened it to find Jonathan standing on the porch, looking disheveled. His once pristine suit was wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and there was an air of desperation about him. Daniel, Jonathan said, voice hoarse. Can we talk? Daniel crossed his arms. That depends. Are you here to actually take responsibility for what you did, or are you looking for a way out? Jonathan flinched. I messed up, okay? I made bad decisions, and I lost everything. Melissa left me, Chloe won't return my calls, and the creditors are circling. I don't know what to do. Daniel studied his brother, searching for sincerity. For so long, Jonathan had been untouchable, the golden child, the success story. Now, he was just a man who had finally met the consequences of his actions. You should have thought about that before you forged Mom's signature and put her home on the line, Daniel said coldly. I know, Jonathan whispered. I was arrogant. I thought I could fix it before anyone found out. But now I have nothing. I need your help, Daniel. Please. Daniel exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. The younger version of himself, the one desperate for his family's approval, would have relented. But that Daniel was gone. No, Jonathan. You need to fix this on your own. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. That's what being an adult means. Jonathan's face fell. He looked down, nodding slowly. I understand. Without another word, he turned and walked away, shoulders slumped in defeat. Daniel shut the door and turned back to his mother, who was watching him with quiet admiration. I'm proud of you, she said softly. He gave her a small smile. I finally feel like I know who I am. And it's about time I start living for myself. Months later, Daniel stood outside the newly opened Parker Financial Assistance Center. A modest building, but one filled with purpose. His mother stood beside him, holding a pair of scissors for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Are you ready? She asked. Daniel nodded. More than ever. As the ribbon fell and the crowd applauded, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. He wasn't the failure his family had once believed him to be. He was a man with purpose, a man who had fought for justice, and a man who had finally carved out a place where he truly belonged. Family is more than just blood. It is built on trust, respect, and genuine care. As Daniel stood outside the modest building that would soon become a financial support center for the elderly, he realized that the love he had once yearned for from his family had been misplaced. It wasn't about seeking validation from those who belittled him. It was about finding and fostering relationships with people who valued him for who he truly was. His mother, once blinded by societal expectations, had come to understand his worth, her teary apologies speaking volumes more than years of silence ever could. But Jonathan, despite his downfall, still clung to the hope that Daniel would save him. This time, however, Daniel knew where to draw the line. You always saw me as a failure, Daniel said, looking his brother in the eye. But failure isn't losing money. It's betraying the people who trust you. Jonathan's desperate gaze wavered, but Daniel had already turned away. He had found his true family, not in shared DNA, but in those who treated him with kindness and respect. And for the first time, he walked away without regret.